She inherited $400,000 at 22, put it in an index fund, and never touched it. 7 years later, it was $900,000. Then her mother told her to buy a house, and for a moment, she almost listened. The call lasted maybe 4 minutes. A lawyer's voice, measured and dry, reading from a document Drift had never seen, about a woman she had loved her entire life. Her grandmother had left her $400,000. She remembers standing in the server station with a tray of empty glasses still in her hand, the ice melting, the din of the lunch rush continuing around her like none of it had happened. The number didn't land as money. It landed as weight. The specific, irreversible weight of someone's entire working life, compressed into a figure and transferred to a 22-year-old who still split her tips in cash and kept her savings in a checking account. She set the tray down very carefully. She didn't tell anyone on shift that day. She printed the bank statement at the library because her apartment printer was out of ink. And that felt like the most absurd part of the whole thing. Standing at a coin-operated machine, feeding quarters in, watching $400,000 emerge line by line on cheap paper. She folded it once and carried it home in her jacket pocket like it might disappear if she set it down. That night she put it on the pillow beside her, face down, and lay in the dark, trying to understand what it meant to be the person responsible for someone else's sacrifice. She had no plan. She had no vocabulary for this. What she had was a number, a piece of paper, and the absolute terror of getting it wrong, of wasting something that could never be replaced, that had cost her grandmother decades she would never get back. Her mother didn't wait. Within 10 days of the lawyer's call, Lena appeared at Drift's kitchen table with a manila folder thick enough to muffle a phone, spreading printed Zillow listings across the surface like she was laying out evidence. "Your grandmother worked her whole life for this, mija. You need to put it into something real." Each listing had a pink highlighter mark on the price and a note in Lena's neat cursive in the margin. "Good bones, close to the bus, check the HOA." The love in it was completely sincere. That was the hard part. Lena wasn't pushing out of greed or thoughtlessness. She was pushing out of the only financial framework she had ever trusted, the one that had kept her family stable through decades of uncertainty. Property you can stand on, walls you can touch. Drift listened. She nodded. She did not say what she was already beginning to feel, which was that none of these listings looked anything like the answer. She went to the library on a Wednesday because she didn't know who else to ask. She couldn't tell her coworkers. She couldn't fully trust her own mother to be objective. She didn't have a financial advisor, had never needed one, didn't know how to find one she could trust. So she went to the 300 section, pulled 3 books off the shelf, and by page 40 of the first one, she had already started to understand that most of what she'd been told about money, her whole life, was a simplification. The line that stopped her, that she read twice, then a third time, was something like this: "The average investor underperforms the market not because of bad luck, but because of good intentions. They move money when it feels right to move it. They sell when it hurts. They buy when it's exciting." She sat with that sentence for a long time. It described every financial instinct she had ever had. She underlined it and then felt a little embarrassed about underlining a library book, so she copied it into her phone instead. She found Yusuf through a fee-only advisor directory she'd read about in that same library book. No commissions, no products to sell, just an hourly rate and a clean desk. The office was small, which surprised her, and he didn't try to impress her with anything. No framed credentials arranged where she'd have to notice them, no leather portfolio on the table. He listened to the whole situation in maybe 15 minutes without writing anything down. Then he picked up a pen and drew a single curve on a yellow notepad. $400,000, left alone, 7% average annual return, 30 years. He slid it across the desk without explanation and let her do the math herself. She photographed the notepad with her phone before she stood up. She's kept that photo in a folder she hasn't deleted since. He told her one other thing on the way out. The hardest part won't be picking the right fund. It'll be not touching it when everything in you says to. She didn't fully understand what he meant yet. She opened the brokerage account on a Tuesday evening, sitting at her kitchen table with a bowl of rice she'd stopped eating. The process took 40 minutes and felt less momentous than she expected. A few form fields, a routing number, a confirmation email with a subject line that could have been from any utility. She transferred the $400,000 in a single move, put it all into one broad index fund, and then sat there watching the confirmation screen like it might change its mind. It didn't. She opened the Notes app on her phone and typed, "Do not touch this money." Then she closed the laptop and looked for a sticky note because she wanted to be able to see the words without having to open anything. The note was yellow, slightly too small for her handwriting, and she pressed it to the lid of the laptop where she'd have to see it every time. It was not a sophisticated strategy. It was just a rule. She was betting that the rule would be enough. After that, life got deliberately smaller. She kept her shifts at the restaurant, signed a 2-year rent-stabilized lease in a building she'd already been living in, $2,000 a month, which everyone told her was a deal, and set up an automatic contribution to her Roth IRA every January. She didn't upgrade her phone. She didn't move neighborhoods. She had exactly one financial account she didn't check more than once a month, one rule she didn't renegotiate, and an ordinary life that showed no evidence of either. People who knew her from before had no idea anything had changed. The strange part was that she liked it that way. There was something almost protective about the invisibility of it. The money existed in a separate layer of her life, quietly compounding, while she caught the bus and split her tips and ordered the regular coffee, not the large. She had found a way to carry something enormous without anyone being able to see the weight. At the end of year 1, the account read $430,000. She had expected more. She didn't say that to anyone, but the feeling was real. A faint, unreasonable disappointment at $30,000 in growth, as if the math owed her faster results than she'd actually agreed to. Curtis noticed she'd been quiet about money lately and filled the silence with his own enthusiasm. He'd moved everything into 3 crypto tokens he'd found through a YouTube channel he described as the real stuff, not mainstream. He showed her the charts on his phone during a break, one thumb swiping through green candles with the confidence of someone who'd already spent the gains in his head. She looked at the charts, nodded, said, "Interesting," and handed the phone back. She did not explain that she was holding a broad index fund and a sticky note. She did not explain anything. She went back to her mise en place and let the conversation end. The first real test came without warning, the way they always do. She woke up to a notification she hadn't set, the brokerage app, a red banner, and a number that didn't make sense at first. The market had dropped hard, and her account was sitting at $347. She sat up in bed and looked at the number for a long time, trying to locate the feeling it was producing. It wasn't panic exactly, it was something lower and slower than panic. A hollow settling in her chest, like the floor had shifted 2 inches and she wasn't sure yet if it would shift again. $53,000 gone, not to a mistake she made, but to something she had no control over. She told herself she knew this was possible. She told herself she'd read about exactly this. Neither of those things helped as much as she'd expected them to. She got out of bed at 2:30 and sat at the kitchen table with the laptop open. She pulled up the brokerage account. She found the sell button without meaning to. Her hand just knew where it was. She sat with the cursor resting on it for what she thinks was about 4 minutes, though it might have been longer. The sticky note was right there. Slightly yellow now, the handwriting a little faded, but she could still read it. "Do not touch this money." She read it 3 times, not because she'd forgotten what it said, because she needed it to be a voice, not just words, and reading it 3 times was the closest she could get to that. Then she closed the laptop and went back to bed, and did not sleep well and did not sell anything. In the morning, she didn't feel good about the decision. She just felt relieved she'd made it before the feeling passed. 6 months later, the account had recovered and climbed past $460,000. She noticed in the same quiet way she'd noticed the drop, alone, in the morning, before work. No champagne, no text to anyone. She just sat with it for a moment and felt something she couldn't quite name, something less than triumph and more durable. The specific satisfaction of a decision that had survived contact with the first real test. She thought about the sell button. She thought about how close she had come. And she thought for the first time clearly that the correction hadn't been a scare she'd gotten through. It had been information. The market had shown her exactly who she was going to have to be for this to work. She filed that away and tied her apron and went to work. But something had changed. She was a little less afraid of the next drop than she had been of the first one. Esme closed on her condo in the spring of year 3. A one-bedroom in a building with a rooftop deck and a waiting list for parking. The Instagram post went up the same afternoon, champagne flute and a key. 658 likes by dinner. Drift bought a bottle of wine she couldn't really afford and went to the housewarming, and she meant every part of the smile she wore all evening. Esme was glowing in a yellow vintage dress, showing everyone the kitchen cabinets, the light in the mornings, the way the bathroom tiles caught the last hour of sun. It was genuinely beautiful. Drift moved through the party being happy for her friend, which she was, and simultaneously doing math in her head, which she couldn't help. By the time she hugged Esme goodbye at the door, she'd already added up the down payment, the closing costs, and a rough estimate of the monthly carrying cost. She didn't say any of it out loud. The Uber ride home took 22 minutes. She checked the account at the 8-minute mark, just opened the app, looked at the number, closed the app. $610,000. She put the phone face down on her thigh and looked out the window at the city going past, the storefronts and streetlights blurring into a single stream of light. She wasn't sad. She wasn't envious, not exactly. What she felt was something more like vertigo. The sensation of standing still while everyone around her appeared to be in motion, buying things, signing things, making real and visible changes to their lives, while her biggest financial decision existed on a server somewhere and looked from the outside like nothing at all. The Uber pulled up to her building. She got out, thanked the driver, and did not tell a single person what was in that account. She just rode the elevator up and unlocked the door and sat in the quiet of her apartment with a number in her head that she didn't know yet what to do with. The texts started arriving in clusters, listing photos, price drops, little red flag emojis. Esme had found her rhythm and she wasn't letting up. You can literally afford this one. Just look, no commitment. Why are you still renting when you have the money? Drift would read them on her break, phone face up on the bar, the restaurant quiet between lunch and dinner service. She never typed back anything real. She'd send a thumbs up or a maybe and pocket the phone, and the thing she couldn't say was that she already knew exactly how much was in that account, and it scared her how badly part of her wanted to listen. Then Lena took it further. She called on a Saturday morning and said she'd found something Drift just had to see. And 40 minutes later they were standing in a one-bedroom in a building with a lobby that smelled like fresh paint and ambition. The kitchen had floor-to-ceiling windows and quartz countertops and the kind of light that makes you imagine a different life. Lena walked through every room like she'd already made the decision. Drift picked up the listing sheet and found the number she'd been looking for. HOA fees, $800 per month. She read it twice. Then she folded the paper in half and slid it into her back pocket without saying anything. They found a parking garage 2 blocks away, and Drift sat on the hood of her mother's car and opened her calculator. She wasn't doing this to win an argument. She genuinely wanted to know. $490,000 purchase price, 20% down, that's $98,000 gone immediately. The remaining mortgage plus $800, HOA plus property taxes plus insurance, she added it up twice to make sure she hadn't made an error. The real monthly number was $3,800. She was paying $2,000. That gap, $1,800 a month, wasn't nothing. Over 10 years it was $216,000, and that assumed nothing ever broke. No special assessments, no rate adjustments. She stared at the number on the screen and felt something clarify inside her, quiet and cold. Inside a coffee shop a few minutes later, Lena ordered for both of them without asking, she always did, and spread the manila folder open between their cups like it was evidence. The mortgage builds equity, she said. Every rent check is money you'll never see again. Drift had heard this her entire life. It lived in her head the way certain phrases do. Not because they're true, exactly, but because they've been said so many times they start to feel like gravity. She didn't have a clean answer yet. She knew the math was more complicated than that, but she hadn't built the full counter-argument in a way she could speak out loud, calmly, to the woman across the table who had worked 2 jobs for 15 years and bought a house and was trying, in her own way, to make sure her daughter didn't waste the only inheritance they'd ever had. A week later, Curtis came in for a Tuesday pre-service shift, grinning like he'd found something the rest of the world hadn't caught up to yet. He pulled out his phone and held up a photo of a narrow 2-story house with a chain-link fence and a for rent sign in the window. House hacking, he explained. He was living in one unit, renting the other. The tenant was basically paying his mortgage. 2 more years, he said, and I'm done working for somebody else. Drift smiled and turned back to her mise en place. She'd heard versions of this plan before. From Curtis specifically, in this exact kitchen, over crypto in January, and REITs the spring before that. She didn't say any of that. She just portioned the sauces and let him talk, because sometimes people need to say a thing out loud before they can really believe it themselves. There was one night she almost moved the money. She needs to say that clearly, because it matters. It was the night Esme closed on the condo. The Instagram posts were still going up, the champagne photos, the keys in hand shot in front of the building. And Drift was home alone at the kitchen table at 11:30, the laptop open, and somehow she had a Zillow listing on one tab and the brokerage account on another. She doesn't fully remember navigating to the transfer screen, but she remembers the cursor sitting over the button, and she remembers what she felt. Not excitement, not confidence, not a clear financial rationale, just the weight of watching everyone around her step forward while she stayed exactly where she was. That was the real thing. It wasn't math. It was the specific loneliness of a decision nobody else can see. What stopped her wasn't discipline exactly. It was arithmetic. She opened a compound interest calculator, the free one, the kind with a white background and no branding, and typed in 2 scenarios. Scenario 1. Leave the current balance invested for 10 more years at a 7% average annual return. Scenario 2. Pull $500,000 for a down payment on a condo, carry the monthly costs, and assume standard appreciation on the property. She ran both. She ran them again with conservative numbers, then with generous ones. In every version, every single version, the gap between the 2 outcomes was not small. She sat with that for a long time. Then she closed the transfer screen first, and then Zillow, and then the calculator, and finally the laptop itself. The sticky note was still there in the morning. The next morning she got out the notebook, not to post about it, not to send to anyone. She's careful about that distinction. She wanted to see the numbers in her own handwriting because something about a screen always felt temporary, like it could be revised. Paper felt like a commitment. She wrote the date at the top, then 2 columns. One for the index fund path she was already on, one for the condo purchase her mother had been mapping out for her since February. She wrote slowly. She crossed out one figure and recalculated. The coffee went cold beside her. She wasn't trying to win anything. She was trying to understand, clearly and without anyone else's voice in her head, what her own math actually said. The numbers, written out, looked like this. $500,000 left in the index fund, growing at a historical average of 7% annually, compounded over 10 years, roughly $985,000. The same $500,000 used as a condo down payment, with a mortgage on the balance, $800 a month in HOA, property taxes, insurance, and maintenance, required her to calculate not just appreciation, but carrying cost and the opportunity cost of what that down payment was no longer doing. Even with generous appreciation assumptions, the gap between the 2 outcomes was 6 figures. She drew a line under both columns and stared at the page. The math wasn't telling her what to do, but it was telling her that the conversation she'd been having with Lena and Esme for months wasn't really a financial conversation. It was something else, dressed up in numbers. She sat with the uncertainty, which is harder than it sounds. The model could underperform. The condo could appreciate faster than she'd assumed. In this city, that wasn't fantasy. She knew she was working with averages, not guarantees, and she'd read enough to understand that the person who acts certain about 10-year market outcomes is usually selling something. What she kept coming back to wasn't a number. It was a question: whose risk was she more equipped to carry? A down market she couldn't control, or a building she'd be responsible for, in a city where something always needed fixing and the HOA board sent emails at 6 a.m. on Sundays? She wasn't afraid of either outcome. She just knew which one she could sit still with and sitting still, she'd learned, was its own kind of skill. 3 weeks later, she was on her break, leaning against the wall in the back alley, when her phone lit up with Esme's name. She picked up expecting the usual, a new listing, a neighborhood recommendation, maybe tickets to something. Instead, Esme's voice was tighter than she'd ever heard it. The HOA had levied a special assessment. Roof repairs. The kind of repair the reserve fund was supposed to cover, except apparently the reserve fund had been underfunded for years, a detail buried in the disclosure documents that Esme had signed without fully reading because the escrow attorney had handed her a stack of paper 4 inches thick on the day she was too excited to sit still. The bill was $6,000, due in 60 days. "Nobody told me about this part," Esme said. And she didn't sound angry exactly. She sounded like someone recalculating. Drift didn't say anything clever. She asked how much, asked when it was due, and asked if Esme needed help covering it. That was the whole conversation. When she hung up, she sat down on the curb. Just sat, elbows on her knees, phone face down on the asphalt beside her, and let the alley be quiet for a minute. She wasn't glad. She wants to be clear about that, because there's a version of this story where the person who made the right call gets to feel smug, and that version isn't true. What she felt was closer to grief, or to the particular tenderness you feel when someone you love gets hurt by something you quietly saw coming and couldn't say. The $6,000 wasn't devastating for Esme, she'd manage, but it was the first cost that hadn't been in the brochure, and Drift understood that it probably wouldn't be the last. Curtis stopped mentioning passive income sometime in October. It wasn't a dramatic announcement. He just went quiet on the subject the way people go quiet when a plan starts costing more than they said out loud. Drift noticed it the way she noticed most things, without comment. He was still in the gray hoodie, still on his phone during breaks, but now he was scrolling instead of showing. One afternoon, she caught a glimpse of his screen, a landlord forum, something about eviction timelines, and he closed it before she could read more. He was covering 2 mortgages on a restaurant salary. She didn't know the full number, but she knew what that kind of math felt like to carry. She thought about saying something, and then decided that the kindest thing she could offer was to just keep showing up the same way she always had. No different, no knowing look, and let him come to it in his own time. Then Lena called with a new angle. She'd been thinking, she said, and her voice had that particular warmth it gets when she's already decided something is a good idea. "What if I co-sign? We could buy it together, mija. Split the carrying costs." The love in the offer was completely real. Drift knew that. Her mother had spent 40 years believing that a deed with your name on it was the difference between surviving and being swept away. But a co-signed mortgage with her mother meant 2 people's credit, 2 people's retirement plans, 2 people's fears, tangled into a single monthly payment. The complication wasn't the relationship. The complication was everything else. A week later, she drove to her mother's apartment and sat down at the same kitchen table where Lena had first spread those Zillow printouts 4 years ago. No folder this time. Drift had her notebook. She told her mother, as calmly and directly as she knew how, that she wasn't buying a property right now. And then she walked through the math, line by line, without apology. The HOA, the property taxes, the opportunity cost of pulling $500,000 out of an account that had already more than doubled. Lena listened in a way she rarely does, quiet, hands around her mug, reading glasses pushed up on her head. The conversation was hard in the way honest things between people who love each other always are. Nobody was wrong and nobody fully won. Lena set her mug down and looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she said something Drift hadn't expected. "I just don't want you to be one market crash away from nothing." That was it. Not greed, not status. Fear. The specific fear of a woman who had watched people lose things and never fully get them back. Everything shifted. The real estate pressure, the manila folders, the open houses. None of it had ever been about the condo. It had been about her mother, trying to build a wall between Drift and the kind of loss Lena had spent her whole life dreading. Knowing that didn't make the math different, but it made the conversation softer, and it made Drift feel less like she'd been fighting an argument and more like she'd finally heard the question underneath it. She walked home in the dark, and ran one more number in her head. Not on her phone, just arithmetic, the kind you do slowly to make sure it stays real. At the current growth rate, if the account kept doing what it had done, another 7 years could take it past 1.4 million. She did not post about it. She did not text Esme. She did not tell her mother. She turned the number over in her mind the way you'd hold a smooth stone, just to feel the weight of it, and then she let it sit there. Quiet, the way the whole strategy had always asked her to be quiet. The city was lit up around her. She kept walking. Year 7 arrived the way all the other years had, quietly, with no announcement. She opened the app on a Tuesday morning before her shift, the same way she always did. Briefly, with one eye, like checking the weather. The balance read $900,000. She looked at it for maybe 4 seconds. Then she closed the app, tied her apron in the mirror by the restaurant door, and went to work. There was no champagne, no screenshot. The number existed somewhere between her and a server in the cloud, invisible to everyone who knew her, and that was exactly fine. She had learned a long time ago that the best financial decisions don't look like anything from the outside. Then Lena sent one more listing. The best one yet, mija. Just look, $420, and they just dropped the price. Drift opened it. She actually read it this time, all the way through. The square footage, the HOA at $650 a month, the property tax estimate, the comparable sales, the last 3 price cuts. She scrolled slowly, the way you read something when you've already made a decision and you're just confirming you still believe it. Then she closed the tab. The brokerage dashboard came back up, green and quiet. No drama, no argument with herself. The listing simply didn't compete anymore, and she was no longer sure it ever had. She opened the notebook, the same one she'd had since year 1, the cover soft now, the corners bent, and wrote a single line on a fresh page, not a Reddit post, not a text to anyone, just her own words, for herself. The boring choice is still the right one, not forever, just for now. She pressed the pen down at the period and held it there for a second. Inside the back cover, flat and slightly yellowed, was the sticky note from year 1. Do not touch this money. Still legible, still true. She closed the notebook. 7 years of doing nothing with $400,000 had quietly become $900,000 of doing nothing. That felt like enough to write down. Here's the thing nobody tells you about patience. It is not the same as doing nothing. Doing nothing is easy. Patience, real patience, the kind that holds through a correction and a friend's housewarming and your mother's open house and a coworker's passive income pitch. That is a daily, active choice. Every month, Drift didn't move the money. She chose not to move it. Every time she closed the app, she made a decision. The people who watched her from the outside saw someone standing still. What she was actually doing was staying in place on purpose in a world where everyone around her was constantly, urgently moving, and most of them were moving sideways. This story doesn't promise anything. The market Drift invested in could fall. The condo her mother pushed her toward could appreciate faster than any index. Nobody sitting still knows what moves next. That's the whole point. What Drift had was a temperament that matched a strategy and math that backed the fit, and the discipline to leave both of them alone long enough to matter. That's not a formula you can copy without copying all 3 parts. The discipline is the hardest part to transfer. Most people can find the index fund. Fewer can leave it alone for 7 years while everyone they know is doing something louder. Drift is at the window now, coffee in both hands, the city going about its morning below. The lease is still signed. The Roth IRA contribution is scheduled. The sticky note is inside the back cover of a notebook in a kitchen drawer. Nothing is dramatic. Everything is in order. She's not certain she's right. Certainty was never the deal. The deal was patience, matched to a plan, held long enough to compound. Outside, someone is probably closing on a condo. Someone else is probably day trading on their lunch break. Drift finishes her coffee and gets ready for work. The person who does nothing, when nothing means staying the course, often wins the game that everyone else is rushing to finish. Not because they're smarter, not because they got lucky with the timing, but because they understood something early and then had the patience to keep understanding it every month, for years. The market rewards that. Not always, not guaranteed, not without risk. But over long enough stretches of time, the discipline to sit still while everyone else moves tends to compound the same way the money does. Quietly, without announcement, into something you didn't fully believe was possible until you looked up one day and the number was there. If this story made you want to understand the actual mechanics, how compounding works, what an index fund really is, how to start when the number in your account is not 400,000, but 400. The first lesson is free. It's in the link below. No pitch, no urgency. Just the math explained clearly, the way Yusuf explained it to Drift in a small office one afternoon with a notepad and a single upward curve. That's where it starts. It can start today. She kept the money invested and closed the Zillow tab for good, but the pressure never fully went away. Would you have made the same call, or would you have bought the house?